In the summer of 2026, Las Vegas is living out a collision that could serve as a parable for the entire American West. Over the city, a vast dome of heat has settled, baking the Mojave Desert and pushing temperatures across the valley floor toward 115 degrees, with the National Weather Service issuing extreme heat warnings and the whole city shimmering in a furnace of superheated desert air. And just a few miles away, at Lake Mead, the enormous reservoir behind Hoover Dam that supplies almost all of the city's water, the level has fallen to the lowest point in its entire history, a pale ring of exposed rock, the famous bathtub ring, marking how far the water has dropped, the surface sitting at or barely above its all-time record low and still declining. Two crises, one of heat and one of water, converging on the same desert city at the same moment. And here's the part that makes it more than a coincidence, the part that turns two separate problems into a single, compounding one. The heat and the water crisis are connected. The very heat that is baking the city is helping to drain the reservoir that sustains it. This title, unlike so many dramatic headlines, is largely true. But the full story contains something the headline leaves out, something genuinely remarkable, and understanding both halves, the real crisis and the extraordinary response to it, is the key to seeing Las Vegas clearly. Let us begin with the heat, and let us be accurate about it. Las Vegas is one of the hottest major cities in the United States, sitting in the heart of the Mojave Desert, where summer temperatures routinely climb past 100 degrees and often well beyond. The year 2026 has been an exceptionally hot one for the city, beginning with a spring that set records for its heat, arriving earlier and more intensely than usual, and continuing into a punishing summer crowned by the current heat dome, which has driven temperatures to around 115 degrees and prompted warnings of dangerous, potentially deadly conditions. This is part of a clear and well-documented trend of rising heat, a trend made vivid just 2 years earlier, in 2024, when Las Vegas recorded its highest temperature in history. An astonishing 120 degrees, shattering its previous all-time record. Now, in fairness and precision, the current readings of this 2026 heat wave, brutal as they are, have not broken that 2024 all-time record. 115 degrees is savage, but it is not 120. So the claim that Las Vegas is breaking heat records is best understood carefully. 2026 has indeed set records, particularly for the heat of its spring, and it sits firmly within a warming trajectory that keeps pushing the desert hotter and the extreme heat earlier and longer, even if the single highest number ever recorded still belongs to the summer of 2024. The heat is real, it is record-setting in important respects, and it is unmistakably worsening. And this heat is not merely a matter of uncomfortable numbers on a thermometer, it is a genuine and growing threat to human life in the city. Extreme heat is, in fact, the deadliest form of weather in the United States, killing more people in a typical year than hurricanes, floods, or tornadoes. And it kills quietly, without the drama of a visible disaster, taking the elderly, the poor, the isolated, and those without reliable air conditioning. In a city like Las Vegas, where summer temperatures now routinely reach levels that can kill a healthy adult exposed for too long, the rising heat translates into real danger for the most vulnerable residents, into swelling demand on the power grid as air conditioning runs without pause, and into a growing challenge for the outdoor workers, the tourists, and the homeless who cannot simply retreat indoors. The heat waves that push the city toward 115 or 120 degrees are not just weather events, they are public health emergencies, straining hospitals and cooling centers and emergency services. So when we speak of Las Vegas breaking heat records, we are describing not merely an abstract climatic trend, but a mounting hazard to the people who live there. One that grows more serious with each passing summer, and one that forms the human backdrop against which the water crisis unfolds. Now to the water, where the title is on even firmer ground, because the crisis at Lake Mead is as historic as it sounds. Las Vegas draws the overwhelming majority of its water, something like 90% of it, from the Colorado River, and it takes that water from Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, held back by the Great Wall of Hoover Dam. And Lake Mead, right now, is at or near the lowest level it has ever reached since it was first filled in the last century. Its surface has fallen to around 1,040 feet above sea level, essentially matching, and threatening to fall below the record low it set in the summer of 2022. The reservoir is down more than 160 feet from its full level, holding barely a third of the water it was built to store, and federal forecasters now expect it to set an outright new record low in the near future. Nor is Mead alone. The entire Colorado River system has fallen to around a third of its total capacity, driven down by a record low mountain snowpack, by more than 2 decades of relentless megadrought, and by reduced runoff from the Rockies that feed the river. This is a genuine, severe, and historic water crisis, and Lake Mead, the lifeline of Las Vegas, sits right at its heart. On the water, the title does not exaggerate at all, and now the connection that binds the two crises together and makes the word simultaneously so meaningful. Because the heat and the water emergency are not merely happening at the same time by chance, they are causally linked, each feeding the other. Lake Mead sits in the open desert, its vast surface exposed to the relentless sun, and it loses an enormous amount of water simply to evaporation, more than 6 feet of depth every single year lifted off its surface and carried away into the air. And the hotter it gets, the faster that evaporation runs. The record heat of 2026, arriving early in a scorching spring and continuing through the summer, has accelerated the evaporation, ramping up the water loss sooner and more severely than in a normal year, so that the reservoir is being drawn down not only by drought and overuse, but by the sheer thirst of the superheated air above it. The heat, in other words, is not just a parallel misfortune occurring alongside the water crisis. It is an active driver of it, literally sucking the reservoir dry faster. This is the compelling and genuine heart of the story. In Las Vegas, the heat and the water crisis are two faces of the same warming, and the one is helping to consume the other. A vivid and sobering illustration of how a warming climate compounds its own dangers, each problem worsening the next. It is worth dwelling on this compounding effect, because it is one of the most important and least understood features of a warming climate, and Lake Mead illustrates it with unusual clarity. We often imagine climate impacts as a list of separate problems, hotter summers here, drier rivers there, as though each could be considered on its own. But in reality, these impacts interlock and amplify one another, so that the whole becomes worse than the sum of its parts. The heat does not merely coexist with the drought, it deepens it, because hotter air pulls more moisture from every exposed surface, from the soil, from the plants, from the snowpack that melts faster and earlier, and from the open water of the reservoirs. A hotter climate is therefore also, in effect, a thirstier one, demanding more water from the land and the reservoirs even as it delivers less. At Lake Mead, this means that the same warming responsible for the brutal heat waves is simultaneously responsible for accelerating the reservoir's decline. A double blow from a single cause. And the effect compounds further still, because as the reservoir shrinks, its surface area relative to its volume changes, and the whole system grows more sensitive to each additional degree of warming. This is the hidden engine of the Western water crisis, the reason it has proven so much more severe than rainfall statistics alone would predict. The heat and the drought are not two problems, but one, feeding on each other, and Las Vegas sits squarely where their combined force is most visible. There is a further dimension that makes Las Vegas's position especially precarious, and it concerns the way the Colorado River is divided. The river's waters were apportioned among the 7 states that depend on it by a compact written back in the 1920s, at a time when Las Vegas was a dusty railroad town of only around 2,000 people. Today, the surrounding county is home to nearly 2.5 million, but Nevada is still bound by that century-old allocation, under which it received by far the smallest share of any of the 7 states, what one local observer memorably called the short end of the stick. And now, as the crisis forces the states and the federal government to renegotiate the rules that will govern the river after 2026, proposals on the table could cut deliveries further, potentially reducing even Nevada's already tiny allocation, prompting the state's leaders to vow to fight. So Las Vegas confronts this convergence of record heat and historic water lows from a structurally disadvantaged position, drawing the smallest legal share from the most imperiled major water source in the country, at the very moment when that source is at its most stressed. It is, on paper, about as difficult a hand as any city in the West has been dealt. And yet, here is the twist that the alarming headline entirely misses, and it is genuinely one of the most remarkable stories in American water management. Despite drawing almost all of its water from a reservoir at its historic low, and despite holding the smallest allocation on the river, Las Vegas is not running out of water. Its taps are not going dry. And the reason is that Southern Nevada has quietly become the most water-efficient major community in the entire American West, and arguably a model for the world. Consider what this city has done. It recycles very nearly all of the water used indoors, close to 99% of it, capturing the wastewater from homes and businesses, treating it, and returning it to Lake Mead, where it earns credits that allow the community to draw that same water again, so that indoor water use is almost entirely a closed loop. It built what locals call the third straw, a deep intake tunnel that draws water from near the very bottom of Lake Mead, engineered specifically so that the city can keep pulling water even if the lake falls to catastrophic levels that would leave the older. Higher intakes sucking air. It banned decorative, purely ornamental grass, the kind that no one walks on, and it pays residents to tear out their turf, slashing the outdoor watering that is the largest drain on any desert city's supply. The third straw in particular deserves closer attention because it is a piece of engineering born of genuine foresight, built in anticipation of exactly the crisis now unfolding. For most of Lake Mead's history, Las Vegas drew its water through intakes positioned relatively high in the reservoir, which was perfectly adequate when the lake was full. But water managers, watching the level fall year after year, recognized a frightening possibility that if the lake dropped far enough, those intakes would eventually be left above the waterline, sucking air while the city's lifeline sat uselessly dry. So, at enormous expense and through a difficult feat of tunneling deep beneath the lakebed, they built a new intake that draws water from near the very bottom of the reservoir, low enough to keep functioning even if Lake Mead were to fall to what is grimly called dead pool, the level at which no water at all can pass through Hoover Dam. It was an expensive insurance policy against a catastrophe that many hoped would never come, and its construction was completed years before the lake reached today's historic lows. Now that foresight is paying off, because whatever happens to the surface level of Lake Mead in the coming years, Las Vegas retains the physical ability to keep drawing its share of the water, a security that cities relying on higher, older intakes simply do not possess. It is a striking example of how planning ahead, of spending money and effort to prepare for a crisis before it arrives, can make the difference between vulnerability and resilience when that crisis finally comes. The results of these efforts are almost hard to believe, and they upend the entire narrative of a desert city helplessly running dry. Over the past 2 decades, even as Southern Nevada's population grew by hundreds of thousands of people, adding whole new suburbs and resorts and communities, the region actually decreased its total consumption of Colorado River water. It grew and shrank its water use at the same time, decoupling the two things that everyone assumes must rise together: population and water consumption, and proving that a desert city can add people while using less water, a feat that once seemed impossible. This is why, even as Lake Mead sits at its historic low and the heat accelerates its decline, the water still flows reliably from the taps of Las Vegas. The reservoir the city draws from is in genuine crisis, but the city itself has engineered and conserved its way to a security that few would have predicted, transforming itself from what might have been the West's most vulnerable major city into, in many respects, its most resilient. The headline captures the crisis, but misses the response, and the response is every bit as real and important as the crisis. So the honest picture holds both of these truths at once, and it is far more interesting than either alone. The crisis is real, record-setting heat, a reservoir at its all-time low, the heat itself actively accelerating the water's decline, a structurally disadvantaged allocation, and the prospect of deeper cuts to come. And the adaptation is also real and remarkable. Through extraordinary conservation and clever engineering, Las Vegas has secured its water supply against exactly this scenario, and its taps are not about to fail. These two things are not contradictory. They are simply both true. and together they tell a story neither of doom nor of complacency, but of a genuine emergency being met with a genuinely impressive response. Las Vegas is, at the same moment, the vivid face of the West's converging crisis of heat and water, and its leading example of how a desert city can adapt in order to survive that crisis. To tell only the first half is to spread needless panic. To tell only the second is to breed dangerous complacency. The truth requires holding both. This balance is not always easy to maintain because there is a strong pull in coverage of climate and water toward one extreme or the other. Some accounts seize on the record heat and the record low lake and paint a picture of a doomed city on the brink of collapse, which is both inaccurate and, in its way, harmful, because despair breeds paralysis. Others, reassured by the reliable taps and the impressive conservation, wave away the crisis entirely, which is equally dangerous. Because complacency breeds the neglect that lets a manageable problem become an unmanageable one. The honest path runs between these, insisting on the full truth that the danger is genuine and must be taken seriously, and that the response has so far been effective and offers real grounds for hope. It matters, then, to be precise about where the real danger actually lies, because it is not where the headline points. The genuine risk to Las Vegas is not that its taps run dry tomorrow. The conservation and the deep intake have taken that immediate catastrophe off the table. The real risks are slower, deeper, and more structural. They are the possibility that the Colorado River system, the source for the entire region, continues its long decline toward a diminished or even semi-permanent low, shrinking the pie that everyone must share. They are the coming cuts that will tighten Nevada's already small allocation and force still harder conservation. They are the steadily rising costs of securing water through ever more elaborate means, and the mounting uncertainty as 7 states fight over the rules for a river that no longer carries what it once did. And they are the sobering possibility that even the world's best conservation cannot fully compensate for a river that keeps shrinking, if the shrinking goes far enough. The danger, in short, is a long grinding tightening, a future of higher costs, harder limits, and deeper uncertainty, all of it made worse by the heat that keeps accelerating the evaporation, rather than a sudden dry apocalypse. It is a serious danger, but it is a different kind of danger than the one the word simultaneously might make you imagine. And this is why Las Vegas matters far beyond its own city limits, because it is at once a warning and an answer for a great many places that will follow. It is a warning because it shows with unusual clarity how a warming climate compounds its dangers, how rising heat and deepening water stress can converge on a single place and feed on each other. The heat draining the water even as both intensify, a compounding crisis that many more regions will come to know as the world warms. But it is also an answer, a living proof that a city can respond, that it is possible to slash water use dramatically, to recycle almost everything, to decouple growth from consumption, and to engineer resilience even while drawing from a source in historic decline. Las Vegas is both the face of the problem and one of the best examples of the solution, and that dual role is precisely what makes it so instructive. Every place that will one day face rising heat and tightening water, which is to say, increasingly, nearly everywhere, has something to learn from the desert city that is baking and running short and, against considerable odds, adapting all at once. So let us return, at the end, to the claim we began with, and answer it as honestly as the evidence allows. Is Las Vegas breaking heat records while its water supply hits historic lows simultaneously? In substance, yes, and unusually for such a dramatic headline, the convergence is real and the two halves are genuinely connected. Las Vegas is enduring record-setting heat, a record hot spring, and a brutal summer heat dome, part of an unmistakable warming trend, even if the single hottest reading still belongs to 2024. And Lake Mead, its primary water source, truly sits at or very near the lowest level in its history, and may soon set a new record low. And most strikingly, the two are linked, because the record heat is accelerating the evaporation that is draining the reservoir, so that the heat is quite literally helping to consume the water. That much of the title is true, and it is a vivid lesson in how a warming climate compounds its own crises. But the full and honest story adds what the headline omits, that despite all of this, the taps of Las Vegas are not running dry because the city has made itself the most water-efficient major community in the West, recycling nearly all its indoor water, reaching deep into the failing lake with an intake built for this very emergency, and cutting its total water use even as it grew. Las Vegas is thus at once the vivid face of the West's converging emergency of heat and water, and its single most impressive example of adaptation, a city baking beneath a record sun beside a record low lake, and yet, through extraordinary effort, still holding on. The crisis is real, the heat is actively draining the water, and the danger is serious, structural, and long-term. But the taps still run, because a desert city decided, against considerable odds, to survive, and that determination, as much as the crisis that provoked it, is the story truly worth telling.